All right. So I couldn't get my second monitor held up, so occasionally I will look to the side of my camera because I printed out my slide notes. But I should know most of this because it's one of my favorite presentations, which is what I was saying earlier. And it's kind of interesting how this talk came about because uh, it's one of those talks where some people just get really angry at something, and I feel like they have to give a talk. And while in part that is a little bit true here, the anger is in that it doesn't need to be this way. And the issue is really just awareness. So for me, I want to keep spreading awareness about how Agile is causing problems at this point in time. So this is Agile is ableist. Here's how to fix it. So as I was just getting at, there are a lot of people who don't like Agile, and there's plenty of people who love Agile, and there's entire programs and Agile coaches around this. Maybe you've been subjected to this, maybe you haven't. So just to clear some things up, I'm not giving this talk because I have had bad experiences with Agile. Yes, I have absolutely had bad experiences with Agile. I don't know exactly how I rolled the dice this way, but I managed to be part of 5 separate instances of Agile transformation at various companies. So I saw a lot of Agile in a lot of different ways. I'm also not giving this talk because I dislike Agile. I actually really like what Agile gets at and where its heart is. That's just not what is seen in the actual implementation. I'm also not giving this talk because I believe Agile hurts accessibility. I believe it absolutely can and does hurt accessibility, but not because of what it is. So the reason I'm giving this talk is because, for one, the number one thing I found in the many Agile transformation projects I've been a part of is that Agile largely leaves design out of the conversation. I'm also giving this talk because bad Agile is worse than no Agile. And finally, the Agile Manifesto, which is where all of these programs kind of sprung forth, isn't an instruction manual. And really what you experience when you're doing Agile in the workplace are people taking generic principles and trying to turn it into something that it really isn't. For just a quick little session outline, first I'm going to give a general introduction to Agile. I'm going to talk about why specifically I have found Agile to be ableist. I'm going to do like a little icebreaker in the middle called perspectives on Agile, which is just me finding tweets of people who have very strong opinions about Agile. And then some reflections from the original writers of the manifesto and a 20-year retrospective on it. And then finally, just give some tips on how to fix it. Cool. And you'll notice that sometimes I'm skipping some slides because I adapted this down from an Access U talk, and their talks are 90 minutes long. But I can always send the slides. They'll be in an accessible PDF or accessible format. All right, so introduction to Agile for those who are not as familiar. First, I'm going to talk about the Agile Manifesto, its history, values, and principles. So Agile was created in 2001 after 17 people who were developers met at a ski resort in Utah to relax and network. And this is when they came up with the Agile Manifesto that was kind of birthed from frustrations they had with the development work they were doing. And their goal was they wanted to create an alternative to documentation-driven, heavyweight software development processes. For those who were in tech back in the early aughts, even before the birth of Web 2.0, really a lot of the interfaces out there that were really hardcore, especially like actual software on computers, you almost had to have an instruction manual to get through it. And it really was created around these fundamental values. So taken directly from the manifesto, Part of it says we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over process and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation. And myself, I kind of even think working software goes beyond into like intuitive working software. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change within the process rather than following a plan no matter what. And in short, it wasn't that they felt, you should only do one of those things. It's that the first instance of each of those series they feel is more important and should be valued more than the other aspects like processes and tools, documentation. So I think what was so interesting when I first started looking into this is I kind of just believed everything that was shared about Agile from the various coaches I had throughout the various transformation projects I was a part of. But I didn't actually just sit down and try to understand and interpret the principles themselves. So I think a quick little review of those really helps ground this entire talk. So the first principle is that the highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Principle 2 is to welcome changing requirements even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. Principle 3 is to deliver working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference to the shorter time scale. And I think for those who are familiar, this is where sprints start coming from. Principle 4 states business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. And again, for those familiar with sprints, this is where the daily scrums show up, and daily stand-ups. Principle 5, build projects around motivated individuals. Give them the environment and support they need and trust them to get the job done. Definitely one of my favorite, and I'm sure that will resonate with many people on this call. Principle 6, the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. Principle 7, working software is the primary measure of progress. So like, does it do the thing? Pretty simple. Principle 8, agile processes promote sustainable development. Also one that I really like. Then it goes on to say the sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. As in, basically, that's just a long-winded way to say keep iterating, make it constantly be useful because you're constantly working on it. Principle 9, continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. Also one I agree with. Principle 10, this one's worded awkwardly. Simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. And just to decode that, because that definitely needed a UX writer's hand there, basically don't do work just for the sake of work. There should be a meaning to the work that you're doing. Principle 11, the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. And finally, principle 12, at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective and then adjusts accordingly. So basically a retrospective, which is good no matter what type of process you're within. So while there may be some that were a little questionable, most of those principles aren't inherently bad or problematic. So what kind of happened? So I'm moving on to talk about Agile frameworks, Kanban, Scrum, and more. I have a picture on the left, which is how I feel when I'm in Agile transformation projects. It's the meme of Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia with a conspiracy theory board with papers and lines drawn everywhere. And it just felt really appropriate for this section. So Kanban has actually existed since the 90s, I believe. And it was actually created in a Japanese car manufacturing company in order to kind of streamline the manufacturing process. In short, it's literally just a visual system for managing work as it moves through a process. It visualizes the process and the work passing through the process through a series of buckets. And the goal is to identify bottlenecks and minimize work in progress, which is a really great feature of Kanban because rather than trying to do 5 things at once, you only do like 2, 3, maybe 3 things at once. And, if you're waiting on someone, then that's not your work in progress. You say it's blocked or you make it very clear what's going on. And then the image here is literally how they did it initially at the car factory, which was just literally use index card and post-it notes on like a cork board to move things around and visualize it. Then there is Scrum, which comes from a rugby term where a bunch of the rugby team members get together. And that's pretty much as I know, but you can always Google rugby Scrum if you want to know more. So this is what's most commonly in businesses right now. It's a project management framework that emphasizes teamwork, accountability, and iterative progress. It's also used to describe the particular sets of meetings, tools, and roles designed to help teams structure and manage their work. So this is where the daily rituals like the daily stand-ups, the retrospectives between every sprint, that's all part of this process. So this is kind of a hardcore data visualization, and I will try and describe it to the best of my ability. But essentially the way a Scrum is supposed to work is it starts with a vision of like what the product should be. Then it moves on to user stories, as in what is the user going to accomplish and what does that mean needs to be built in the product. And from that, a product backlog is generated. And then that is a giant pool where a sprint backlog comes from, where you take just like little bite-sized chunks. And then you have a 2 to 4 week sprint with daily rituals to check in on work. You move on, you go through the review, the retrospective, you go back to the product backlog, and it's supposed to be something that can just keep feeding itself again and again and again. And then finally, there's Scrum Band, which I have sort of been a part of one of my past workplaces. And essentially, it's a hybrid framework between Scrum and Kanban that minimizes the batching of work and creates this pool-based system. And it's more flexible than straight Kanban or straight Scrum because it has the repeatability and the expectations of Scrum, but with the flexibility of Kanban and saying, okay, sometimes we just need to break out of the cycle a little bit. In short, it's just not being burdened by the project methodology. And as we'll get into with Agile perspectives later, the rituals are something that come up a lot for people. Here's a slide with other variations. As I mentioned, the slides will be shared later. They'll be accessible. So it's safe, less, and dad. They're just variations in case you're interested. You can always Google more. Is there a question? Okay. I thought I heard someone come off chat, but that's okay. So the next section is about what from that makes Agile ableist. So the first thing I noticed after going through the principles is that design was completely an afterthought. Principle 9 was taught and principle 11 were the only two that even mentioned design. Principle 9 says that good design enhances agility, and then principle 11 says the best designs emerge from self-organizing teams. Otherwise, this was created by developers for developers. And that's why there is a giant gap in the Agile Manifesto. So I actually forgot to mention it at the slide back there, but if you think about how the Agile Manifesto was created, it was basically people on holiday at a ski resort. They were all white men. And they had the privilege to get together as a group and go skiing. Because of my disabilities, I can't even ski. And honestly, because of barriers in being able to code with certain frameworks because of my motor disabilities, that's one reason why I am in accessibility and more of a consultant than a coder, because it's not that I can't code, it's that I can't code in today's society because of access issues. So obviously, there's a lot of inherent privilege to how the Agile principles came up in the first place. But getting back to design as an afterthought, the reason that this is such a problem for accessibility and disabled users in particular is because, according to a DQ case study, about 67% of accessibility issues originate in the design phase. So if you're creating a process that mostly leaves out design and at the very least does not even remotely center it, you're going to have a bad time because you can't outcode accessibility issues. That's just not the way it works. At least what I have found and other people I've worked with have found is that often in Agile implementations, design is pigeonholed into development sprints, 5-day isolated design sprints, or just simply forgotten, and they think it's just magically going to happen. There's this really great quote from John Azelwood from an article, Agile and Design, How to Avoid Frankenstein in Your Product. It's a great article. I highly recommend it. Designers thrive on exploration. We aim to find the best creative solution for the problem at hand. As the project dives into features and stories, it's easy to get stuck designing details with no real understanding of the bigger picture. And really, this is part of the issue of design sprints. And John Azelwood also said, Agile sacrifices cohesion in the name of creativity. And there's a sketch here from a book, which I actually think I have, about doing sprints right. There's a lot of books now about doing Agile correctly because that's just the state that we're in. And so this 5-day design sprint is on Monday, you make a map and choose a target. Tuesday, you sketch competing solutions. Wednesday, you decide on the best. Thursday, you build a realistic prototype, and Friday, you test with target customers. I feel like there's a couple things kind of funky there, because how do you decide on the best without even including the customers to begin with? But I mean, I think you'll just notice that these are the features that are happening. So I'm not sure if any of you have literary nerd friends, but I have a lot of literary nerd friends, and they always do the whole, well, technically it's Frankenstein's monster, not Frankenstein. So that's why I called this slide, actually the correct term is Agile's monster, because Agile isn't the problem. Scrum processes start with vision, but really that's just a complete oversimplification for today's product lifecycle. Like, who is defining that vision? Where is it coming from? Is it a product owner deciding for the users what they want? Or is it users offering feedback? And what is that feedback like? There's also just this issue where this disconnects the entire user flow. And this was something that specifically when I was at Wells Fargo, and it was a very complicated application, it came up again and again and again. We were being asked to only test the accessibility of individual components rather than the entire flow. But when everything that we were doing, and there are certain criteria, like for instance, consistent identification, consistent navigation, there are literally parts of accessibility you can't consider and can't test for unless you're looking at the full flow. And in short, that article got to the point of just stop treating design like a kid's collage art project. It is a bigger picture, and there's a part of that that needs to be respected, even if you are including design in more of a sprint-like fashion. The other reason Agile is ableist is that accessibility right now just isn't the default. So the principles I've highlighted here from the manifesto are principle 1, our highest priority is delivery of valuable software. Principle 7, working software is the primary measure of progress. And principle 9, continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. But the problem is, what is actually packed into phrases like valuable and working software? What is technical excellence and good design? To me, I consider accessible software working software, but that is not the status quo definition. Technically, accessibility should be included in functional testing. That is not our reality. The fact is that we live in a deeply systemically ableist world, and that extends to the workplace and our definitions, even if we are aware of it. And it's a hard beast to battle on your own. And a big part of that is also just the general issue with learning at breakneck speeds. Obviously, as an accessibility consultant, a lot of the Agile transformation projects I was on also included teams that had very little or no knowledge of accessibility. And many development sprints basically start without verifying base competence. And I would always emphasize, you can't just jump into an accessibility sprint and expect it to actually last 2 weeks when that competence isn't there. And it puts accessibility professionals in the uncomfortable position of teaching high level concepts at breakneck speeds during in progress work, and everyone's going to have a bad time. It's not fair to anyone in that situation. And finally, and this is one that I really hope you guys take away, velocity or speed is contraindicated. For those who are not medical spoonies like I am, medical contraindication, that's a medical term that where it makes a particular treatment or procedure inadvisable. So 26% of the US is disabled. Only 19.3% of disabled people were employed in 2019. And that basically means that 5% of the workforce is disabled. Assuming all of these percentages, that means an 8-person Scrum team should, in theory, have at least one disabled member. I'm pretty sure that rarely happens. And here, I'm not even talking about an accessibility professional. I'm just talking about an 8-person developer Scrum team. And the reason velocity is contraindicated so much is because if you think about velocity, it's not just about speed, it's about direction. And if you are going at breakneck speeds in the wrong direction, it's going to take that much longer to come back. And so specifically, the 3 principles that don't work this way are principle 2, welcome changing requirements even late in development. That sounds like a prime way to abuse people's time and energy, especially if they're disabled and don't have that time or energy to spare. Principle 3, deliver frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. Now we're assuming the ways that people work, and some people are burst workers, some people are more measured. Both are valid. And then principle 8, team members should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. I have 5 primary disabilities and 20 subconditions. I cannot maintain a constant pace indefinitely. I will wake up tomorrow and not know how much work I can get done until I take stock in the morning. So already the inherent bias from the people who wrote the Agile Manifesto is showing through these issues. I mean, people just aren't robots. I already covered most of these, but many types of neurodivergence are defined by bursts of output. Those with chronic illness need to work around their symptoms and or their treatments. And changing requirements can cause distress and disorientation for certain types of neurodiverse people and mental health disorders. It's not going to be a one size fits all approach. And that's basically a lot of Agile is trying to create robots. And that just isn't where we are right now. I'm going to do a quick time check. So I'm going to leave presenting mode. Okay, I'm actually doing better than I thought. Awesome. All right, so now we're gonna kick back after all of that really hardcore information and just have a little bit of catharsis, a little bit of salt with some perspectives on Agile. So 2 years ago, when I first started trying to understand what other people were saying about Agile, I found this really awful Twitter hashtag called Agile kills kittens, which is very strong. But there was a reason to be that strong, and it's because a lot of people have been harmed by Agile. There's also Agile sucks. There is Agile is fragile. I actually really like Agile is fragile because it points out issues in the process and why it is a fragile process. And then there's also anti-Agile. So if you want to hear perspectives, you can always use these just to find out what people are saying. So here's a tweet from Twitter that was from November 26th, 2018 by Maxim Lazarovich. And it says, UX design will never, ever effectively work inside of an Agile environment. Then Rainer K said, about 2 years in Scrum teams, Agile equals working at a conveyor belt. That whole constant pace idea, which is frankly anti-human. Hashtag Agile sucks. Gypsy Danger, also on Twitter, every day I have to attend a sprint planning meeting. I contemplate quitting and never coming back. Hashtag Agile sucks. Hashtag IT. I'm not going to read this entire quote, but there's a really great article by a Dorian Taylor called Agile is Trauma. And essentially, Dorian gets into the history a little bit more and states that it's, to quote him, an immune response on the part of programmers to bad management. That the whole reason the manifesto started, and if you look at their reasonings, it is why they started, had to do with bad managers. And it's, at least in Dorian's opinion, that the document is an expression of trauma, and anything that comes from the manifesto is continuing to carry the baggage. I don't know how much I agree with that. I think it just has kind of grown way past where it meant to go. But I do think that this is, a good point, which is if, hypervigilance can be very important. It is basically just protection, but it also doesn't necessarily lead to the best decision making because you already have walls up and you're already trying to react rather than to prepare or think of a new way of doing things. Basically, Agile is a reaction. And then a final perspective, and this was something that an amazing accessibility QA person I used to work with would say. There's a Price is Right meme on this slide, and it says, "Welcome to Agile," or not Price is Right. Oh no, I forget the name of the show. It's a bunch of comedians where they make up points and they have like little games where they all improv. I'm gonna check chat real quick just to see if someone knows what it is. What's my line? Thank you. It was gonna bother me because I know that also wasn't in my slide notes because I, wouldn't normally forget it. Welcome to Agile, where the user stories are made up and the points don't matter. And that's basically, I'm not gonna lie, that was something that kept me very level-headed throughout the worst of the Agile transformation programs I was a part of. And for those who aren't familiar, there are points you assign to each user story, or essentially minor block of work, where you predict how long you're gonna take to do a particular task. It's one of those things where how much time are you spending thinking about doing the work rather than actually doing the work? And that's how a lot of developers feel, that they spend time eating rather than doing. So a couple of notes from the actual people who wrote the Agile Manifesto. And then I've already mentioned multiple instances of where we could do better with Agile throughout this. I'm going to wrap them all up at the end. So for 20-year perspective, I think it is important to remember that this is 2 decades old. Should we really be using a philosophy and making it like the cornerstone of all modern tech production when it's 20 years old? It was before Web 2.0, so it was WCAG 1.0. It wasn't even the modern requirements, and we were in HTML4 and CSS2. Companies were a lot less self-aware. They also weren't addressing diversity and inclusion, especially systemic issues. So the problems of 2001, at least that the company was willing to recognize, were nothing like the problems that are trying to be solved through UX design and other technology production nowadays. That was around the time of the birth of Web 2.0, so UX design really was in its infancy. And 55% of internet users, it looks like something got deleted here. Only 55% of the population were internet users in 2022, but it was 87% at the beginning of January 2020. So there were just fewer people on the web doing things back then as well. And there's even 4 writers that are now against Agile because they've seen what happened and they were like, this isn't working. This isn't what we should be doing right now. So one of these people, Dave Thomas, said, "I think time has proven me right. The word Agile has been subverted to the point where it is effectively meaningless, and what passes for an Agile community seems to be largely an arena for consultants and vendors to hawk services and products." Because early on, when they started creating these like Agile coaches and these new services, Dave Thomas was just like, this is not what we were trying to do. Another one, Brian Merrick said, teams that have strong internalized values will stick to good Agile practices and get good Agile results, while teams without guiding values will drift into the ditch. And generally speaking, if you hear more of what Brian Merrick has to say, this is from a keynote at Agile Development Practices. It's really just like a very bare bones framework. People who already want to do good and do better in processes will succeed. Those who don't, like it doesn't matter. The framework isn't fixing anything. So how can we fix this Agile problem in tech right now? This is not a slide, but I will just say it is no individual professional's job to fix the Agile problem. But I think just outlining its gaps and its issues and having that be a collective voice can help shift the needle a little bit. But one of the ways to fix it is to center agility around designers and users. And this gets back to the issue of design not really being a part of Agile and the Agile Manifesto. And it will continue to fail if we continue to center it around software developers. In fact, I would even go as far as to say most software developers I have worked with wish that there were more design resources and like formalized design, because it makes their job easier and they don't have to be designers. Most developers don't want to be, or they would be designers or design technologists. It is 20 years later. Web 2.0 is entering adulthood. I would even argue it's in adulthood at this point. Developers are not responsible for the UI like they were in 2001. We have UX designers. How well that's implemented varies on the company, but this is something we have. And UX design will continue to be seen as a roadblock until we normalize the ongoing process of research and ideation. What was always seen as the process before people shifted to Agile was what was called waterfall methodology. So I do want to caution, don't necessarily go chasing waterfalls. A lot of people I've spoken with have felt that UX design as a full process lends itself more to waterfall than to Agile. But I think it really depends on the task. You have to do what makes sense. So Kaja Tojika recommends waterfall for research, but Agile for design. And research is almost like Kanban, where there's like a set number of things that you do, and it needs to get completed at a certain point. You're going to have to rely on users getting back to you. You're going to have to rely on stakeholders getting back to you. You can only make that ship run so smoothly. In another article, UX and Agile don't work together, right? Catalina Mania emphasizes that Agile is not a process, it is a healthy mentality. And specifically, their advice is to respect the need for initial ideation and discovery phases as their own thing. Resist the urge to do all the research up front. That literally is counter to Agile. Agile is recognizing that users should be involved throughout the entire process. And make sure that key stakeholders in the business support UX processes. Sure, that's a pain point for many. So there can be a modern approach to Agile and lean UX. So I was even just trying to decode this over the past week. So I will do my best to describe this data visualization. So essentially I have 3 cogs, one for UX design encompassing research, ideation, prototypes, another cog, which is stakeholder feedback, and another cog, which is development prototyping. And specifically, like the type of stakeholder feedback that you just have to do, it's the bureaucracy that's slowing things down, but it's an important cog. So stuff like legal, risk and compliance, product, cybersecurity. And then under development, prototyping, a good agile process allows freedom to test new code or concepts and time to create bare bones prototypes to actually test them with various different types of technology. And typically this works best with 2 to 4 week sprints or a pull-based Kanban with baked in learning time for accessibility if it is new to the team. And then for UX design, ongoing research to discover gaps and new opportunities. And specifically, I made this the larger gear of the three to represent the heavier load of UX and UI design. And these sprints should really take more like 4 to 8 weeks long, like if we have to box them in. And this is not really what's happening. I've heard of some people who've tried this where they make the design twice as long as the development. And it has led to things getting done more quickly because they're fixing less things. They're changing less things down the road that frankly never should have happened to begin with. And another big thing to fixing this agile problem is to define and reinforce what accessibility competencies are required before a project can start or a sprint can start. Yes, learning is ongoing, but certain design sprints and development sprints should not happen until they have a base proven competence in, for instance, semantic HTML, keyboard skills, etc., like ARIA for the developers. And then for proven work in actually coding with these concepts within a team environment. And that's where our prototyping really comes in. And then this is something a lot of people say, you just have to bake in accessibility. A lot of people think of it more as a technical and risk-based bureaucracy that needs to be managed. But if you think instead about disability inclusion, it's people focused and in many cases can actually make it easier to do. Teams can only achieve true agility and velocity if inclusion is embedded in the culture and the processes of the team. Otherwise, you're just constantly course correcting. And getting back to those sprints and those ceremonies, just really resist standing on ceremony. Daily stand-ups aren't going to work for every team and every person. Retrospectives aren't always going to work in the same way. Do what makes sense for the team and for the product in question. Again, getting back to velocity. It's about speed in a specific direction, but if you're going in the wrong direction, but you're just letting it happen because you have to go through the ceremonies, that's kind of the problem. But the whole reason ceremonies were created was to prevent that from happening. But they've just turned into kind of just almost a micromanaging check-in in a lot of cases. So just establish a frequency based on the team and based on your project. And don't be afraid to retire old ceremonies and try new rituals out. And finally, and this is the big one for me, there are so many lessons to be learned from disabled people that can prevent the ableism in Agile. So the first one is a lot of times medical professionals will say therapy first, medicine second, surgery third. But as someone whose joints like to fall out all over the place, that doesn't necessarily work. Sometimes I am going to need surgery. Sometimes therapy is better than medicine. Sometimes I can't do therapy until I have medicine. So don't just follow something blindly. Sometimes a mix of different things is best. And that's why I like stuff like Scrumban. Also approach Agile the way that people with chronic pain approach people who suggest stuff like yoga as if yoga is going to cure a genetic disorder. At the end of the day, people don't know what I need as a disabled person. And generally speaking, product owners, unless they have research, don't know what users want from an application or a website. So think of Agile the same way, both for like internal and external stakeholders. Oh no, it looks like I was trying to fix some overlapping issues. It looks like I deleted part of this next bullet. And symptom management and routines can become great guides for figuring out how to do Agile better. You know, I've had to do a lot of self-learning to understand that routines that used to work for me don't work anymore as my body changes and as I have to tweak and change my symptom management. Sometimes I need to bake in breaks. Sometimes, even though my brain wants me to work for 4 hours at a time, my body can't be at a desk for that long. And just understanding the flexibility inherent in routines and in respecting human behaviors, let me tell you, people who are chronically ill and have chronic pain are great at that stuff. Even if they're not great at it, they're still better than the average bear, one could say. And also, there are attention and memory issues. Create parking lots for idea incubation, documentation, and knowledge sharing. And that is it. I am all game for some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions that they wanted to voice out loud, of course, please do bring yourself off of mute and go ahead and ask the question and or use the raise hand feature. And of course, if you wanted to ask in chat, we can do that as well. Looks like we have one question. Is there value in thinking of pointing in good velocity as spoon theory? Sorry, as a type of spoon theory. They corrected it here.
You know, I've thought about that a lot. Because so for those who are unaware of spoon theory, it's the idea that everyone starts the day with a certain number of spoons. But those, especially with chronic illnesses like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and the like, how many spoons it takes to do a task may be greater than that of someone without their particular disability. And also the number of spoons you wake up with in a given day could be different. And I think there's I definitely think thinking of velocity as, or good velocity as a type of spoon theory is good. And I really feel like maybe people are trying to start with too many spoons at the beginning of the sprint. And that's one of the, like, always, every Agile transformation, the developers are like, this stuff is going to be super easy. I'm just going to do the thing. But they don't think about every like security check, every type of QA test that they're going to have to pass or have to fix things before they can actually finish their sprint. I have yet to be part of an Agile transformation where the first 2-week sprint doesn't turn into a 3 or 4-week sprint. That's been pretty consistent in my experience. I'm going to look at some of the other comments. Seems like Agile should have iterated upon itself. I agree. But, you know, we are the ones in some of these processes, and I do think that there are opportunities to shift it a little bit. Oh, do you want to explain rugby, Santina? I just saw your comment.
Yeah, I'm a little afraid to because somebody else is on rugby, but essentially everybody is kind of getting in the middle and pushing together towards one goal. It is the most archetypical visual, I think, of rugby when people come together. It seems incredibly disorganized, but it's actually more organized than meets the eye.
And I think that's why people like the comparison. But also these rugby players in many cases are pros or just like very talented amateurs. So they they know what they're getting into, even though it looks like a mess. Whereas a lot of times I've seen Agile just be a mess.
Yeah, I think that's an apt analogy. Again, folks, if you want to come off of mute and ask any questions, please do feel free.
It can even be more general and less agile, just about my experience with accessibility processes.
It looks like we have one that says, don't you think if accessibility is baked in the definition of done, there can be progress and better products?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's where it gets back to, like, in theory, if working and valuable software is including accessibility, and that's why Carl Groves, I know, is a real big fan of Agile, but he also thinks about it in a very pro accessibility way because he actually cares about disability inclusion. That just isn't the natural order of things. And I would even go as far as to say part of the issue, I think, is that accessibility is still relegated to bureaucracy because it comes from an audit first mentality, where even if you are building a program from the get-go, people are still thinking about how it's going to translate into an audit or how it's going to translate into a VPAT, and they're not focusing on, okay, well, how are people going to use this? How is this going to help disabled people or remove some barriers for them or delight them even, God forbid. And I personally have a lot of passion around that topic because the two assistive technologies I use, which I didn't really introduce at the beginning, I'm a native user of Windows high contrast mode, and I'm a speech recognition user. I have use of my right hand, and you'll see my left arm move, but I like to say it's for decoration. I can't type more than like a word with it. But I really try and not rip the tendons in my arm because that hurts. So I try to use my voice as much as possible. I don't exist in the WCAG standards, not really. So I'm all like user research, inclusive design. I can speak anecdotally, but there isn't even like web aim surveys that have covered my needs at this point. Ooh, just to share for those who aren't able to catch up in chat, waterfall is also very bad for accessibility. We had issues that wouldn't be fixed until the next planned release in a year. Yeah, I've been there.
Tori, I have a question that if
Yeah.
waterfall is not good, agile is not good, then can a hybrid process can work? And if so, then what can be agile? What can be, the waterfall approach?
Yeah, I think it's funny because first I'm going to decode what I think people are saying when they say the agile approach. So I think the agile approach by itself is fine. But agile approach, a lot of people say that and they mean sprints, where it's always regimented and always repeated in a certain way. When I say agile, I'm also including Kanban, where maybe you're doing the same amount of work every week, but what you're working on, like where you're moving to, it has that flexibility and that structure. I mean, Kanban, you don't even have to work in 2-week sprints, but that's why people like Scrumban, just so they could be more predictable with their roadmap. That was literally, they were like, well, let's take the only good things about sprints, which is expectations management, and add it to Kanban. I definitely don't think waterfall is it, because it's building like a giant product and it's taking like 6 months. And then by that point, you may have created something nobody wants to use. So I think agile is the correct approach. I think it needed iteration. I think people needed to stop getting caught up in the new ceremonies and sprints and even just look at what made it work for making cars. I mean, I don't even want to know what's behind making cars and like car manufacturing. but they saw a problem. I even want to say, I think it was Toyota that came up with the first Kanban, but don't quote me on that. But they were like, okay, we need to visualize this and figure it out because we're running into issues where people don't have work because like this other part of the team needed more people and we needed to shift people. So I think Agile is the answer, I guess, that's the very long-winded way of saying it.
Thank you.
All right, I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes. Of course, if anybody has any questions in the meantime, please do feel free either to come off mute and ask or to put it in the chat. Otherwise, Tori, I really appreciate you coming and giving this talk. It's been really amazing. And I just wanted to give some just housekeeping things. One thing I forgot to mention, just as the group, Ally Chai, is we are looking for co-organizers. You might have noticed it's just Nick and myself today. We have lost a couple of individuals who were volunteering with us. So if you'd like to volunteer, please do reach out to either one of us. We'd be happy to have you. There is very minimal commitment. You can kind of see if you've been to these meetups, we announce it, we organize the events. Usually it's either Nick or myself reaching out to other people, but we could use some help with advertising, with Twitter and various different kinds of things. So please reach out to us. Tori, I saw that you raised your finger. Were you just noticing a comment?
Yeah, I was noticing a good comment from Jason. The verbiage used in Agile, stand-ups and sprints are ableist as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and it looks like we have a question. Did you find any of the 5 transformation teams got better at the whole process, or were they all terrible?
Oddly enough, and this is very rose-colored glasses compared to where I was literally thinking about this and ruminating the past week. What I felt was the worst overall experience, where Agile transformation took a project that was supposed to be 6 months. And by the time I left 2 years after the contract, it was still not done. I actually feel that even though it was really rough for so much of that time, the amount of improvement they did and what they even started rejecting as just not making sense and like, let's stop fitting a square peg in a round hole. I felt that there were some great conversations as a part of that. For myself and my neurodivergence, it was very painful because I don't do well with constantly changing processes. And it was 2 years of that nonstop. So it was not great for me, which is probably why it's my least favorable in memory of experience. But honestly, the people and how they handled it, I would not have made it and I would have quit if it weren't for how they reacted to the bad parts.
Right. We'll just keep hanging out then for the last 5 minutes, unless anybody.
Can I give a quick little blurb on my nonprofit?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. So this is really more of like I try not to be too political about processes when really in relation to my nonprofit, but I do have a nonprofit which is currently working really hard on building a learning platform and an HTML component library. In the slides I'll be sharing later. Should I just send those to you, Santina?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. There's like links and stuff, and it's Digital Allies, and it's A11IES after the hashtag A11Y. And yeah, we're doing some really, really exciting things, and we're going to have some learning programs that are just really rooted in understanding disabled users rather than trying to teach to WCAG. So definitely, oh, thank you for Nick shared the website on the chat. So there was going to be a lot of new stuff. We've been doing a lot of stuff in the background, but come October, there's going to be tons of stuff. So definitely keep an eye out.
Thank you, Tori, for presenting and everyone for joining us.